It's been a really fun morning. I hope you're excited about Christmas and you're having fun with this. There is a way that we talk about this in the church. We call it Advent. And Advent is this idea, this word that means arrival or coming. It's a season in which we anticipate the coming of Jesus into the world. We join those 2,000 years ago who were longing for God to answer their prayers, for God to send a Savior into the world. And it's interesting because you and I know that we still find ourselves as people of Advent. As the followers of Jesus, we pray, Lord Jesus, come. And we are filled with the spirit still of Advent, of longing and hoping, oh Lord, that you'll come. And so I'm excited for the next few weeks, what we're gonna be talking about on our Sundays and our Christmas Eve service. It's just, there's some real beauty in the things we're gonna do, but to do that, we have to kind of get into some messiness. And to do that today, I'm so pleased that our intern AJ gets to join us. I was 20 years old, a junior at Biola, the first time our pastor invited me to preach in a service. And AJ is one of our two interns, along with Jenna, who you got to hear teach you about Hebrew irony. And so we are very blessed to have these bright students and get a chance for them. The funny thing is, I've known AJ since he was like those kids being dedicated. He was, his parents, Jim and Carrie, Jim was one of my favorite youth pastors that I would go to camp with and a colleague of mine. And so literally I've watched AJ grow up to be the little guy running around, bouncing, singing, and doing all those kinds of things. And so I want you to welcome AJ here to the stage as he shares.
All right, good deal. Hi, everyone. I'm AJ, and for those of you that don't know me, like Bill said, I'm a student at Biola, and I've been with Beachpoint since the beginning of this summer. And today we're going to be covering a lot, but I wanted to kind of get you guys into the Christmas season with two stories that might invoke some Christmas emotions for you. All right? So, to help get you to know me better, you need to know that I grew up in San Bernardino, California. That's originally where I was born for the better half of my childhood. And what happens every year is that, as a kid, I didn't know, at any time during the month, something called the Santa Chase would happen. So basically, you'd be sitting at home, imagine in the quiet, any day during the month of December, you're watching your Christmas movies, you're baking, you're doing nothing, whatever you're doing. But you'd be sitting in your living room, and outside, it would sound like the end of the world is coming down the street. You'd hear sirens, there'd be huge lights. If you weren't from the area, it was time to evacuate. You didn't know what was going on, but I don't want to be here anymore. If you were from the area, you would run outside in whatever you were wearing and come to find a parade float. Multiple floats. It was all of the local law enforcement, emergency response officials having their vehicles and their personal cars or whatever you have it dressed up in lights and decorations, throwing candy canes at kids, going for bonus points, whatever you have it. And we would always anticipate this event every year. And the chase part of it is that once they leave, the fun part is that you would get in the car and you'd roll down the windows and you would listen, trying to figure out where in the world they just went. Because they don't follow the main streets. They go through the neighborhoods and they make it a point to try to shake you. And the fun part about this, though, is that if you could track them down, you could find them another time, and eventually get to see Santa at the very end. And so this photo right here, for those of you who don't know that I have three brothers and sisters. I'm one of the three in this photo, so that's how long ago this was. That there's a fourth one missing. And it was a tradition, and it still is. We've since moved to a different city that's adopted the same tradition. But I do want to say that some things that this story invokes are maybe some words that associate Christmas with you. So I got a word bubble for you, and these are pretty typical, right? Merry Christmas, snow, lights, turkey's up there. That's pretty good. Bethlehem, star, Jesus, all of the typical things that arrive during Christmas time, right? I know some of you have already started November 1st and are way ahead of me, but this is day one. So the issue with this bubble is that I actually have a second story to share with you that doesn't exactly fit in this bubble. So every year, Christmas Eve was something we did at my grandparents' house on my mom's side of the family. And it was a point that you were there on Christmas Eve together. It's just normal. And what ended up happening through toward the end of my middle school, beginning of my high school years, is that my grandmother on my mom's side ended up getting diagnosed with brain cancer. And what that ended up leading to was her deciding that the day I want to go home to be with the Lord is going to be Christmas Eve with all her family present. And so that's what happened. We were all there present with her, and she ended up passing. And what's interesting about that is that all of a sudden these words don't exactly describe that anymore. I'm not thinking about that anymore. It's almost as if I'm now faced with the reality of what's actually happening during Christmas. And so what you'll begin to see today is that Christmas kind of went from cookie cutters to really, really messy.
AJ I think has made a great point that we want to bring up with you today is that Christmas can be complicated. It can be a complicated set of emotions. We think of these traditional themes of joy and hope and peace. And for some of us, those things get replaced with things like frustration and anger and fatigue. Schedules get pressed. We have more expectations. You have complicated family dynamics. There's a lot of things. Some of you might remember in 2018, we did a series called Best Christmas Ever. We had this photo, if you were here, of the Hall family. And it was kind of this great way of representing how Christmas can be for us. You've got this cropped, perfect family with the fireplace and the Christmas tree. And then if you kind of fade out of what they want you to see, you realize there's dirty laundry, there's things not put away, there's all these things. In fact, my favorite Hall is missing. Sadie isn't even in the picture. She didn't even make the picture. That's how complicated things can get sometimes with life. And so I look at this picture and it's kind of like it pictures this kind of perfect sense of we want it to be all contained, right? But that sometimes there's a lot more that's going on. But one of the things that we see in the scriptures is that the invitation to us at Christmas is to be drawn into this manger scene. To see what God is doing, to marvel at this, to be filled with his peace and his presence. In the quiet obscurity of this inn in Bethlehem, a king is born. But not just any king, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And while most of the world misses what's going on, we see the heavens open up, angels just explode in song and praise. We read about Magi traveling hundreds of miles to come into the space to see this king, to worship this king. We see prophets hold Jesus as a baby up in their hands, knowing that their prayers have been answered. God has heard them. And one of the things that you see in the Christmas stories is that those who beheld the miracle of what God was doing could do nothing more than worship. In this Christmas season, this is our invitation, we know you have a lot going on, but we're inviting you to kind of press through the hurry, through all the other things, and behold what God has done in the world through Jesus. And so here's the big idea that we want to give you over this next month. The series where we're kind of taking you is we're going to be helping you see that Christmas invites us to behold Jesus as the King of our life. To behold Jesus as the King of our life. This is our prayer for you. And to behold something is so much more than simply to see something or to glance at it. To behold something is to take in its majesty. It's to look deeply into something and to see its brilliance, to see its beauty, to see its magnificence. And we don't want Christmas to be all these things in a word bubble, oh, and Jesus. But the invitation is for you to try to press through all those things and to see and to behold Jesus. Because when you behold him, like all the other characters, I think too, you will see the beauty of what God has done. You too will find yourself in a place to worship. But to do this, the Christmas story it's challenging. There's a lot of parts to it that are not easy to talk about. Like AJ's story, there are parts that are beautiful and there are parts that are just challenging, difficult, messy. And so this is what we're gonna invite you to do, is behold the mess that's Christmas. And we're gonna use the account that Matthew gives over the next few weeks. We're gonna read Matthew 1 and 2. And this can feel, even today, one guy described it after last service. He's like, wow, that got really emo. And for those of you who grew up in the 90s, who maybe understand a little better, but there's like a darkness to part of the beginning of Matthew's story. It's messy, but here's today's big idea, is that we're inviting you to see through the mess of Christmas. Because until you see through the mess, you have to work through the mess to actually be able to behold Jesus. If you try to avoid it, if you try to go around these messy parts, I don't know that you can really behold the beauty of what God is doing in Jesus. But if you will, with God, if you will work through this, you will see something beautiful that God is doing. So let me invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1. We want a Hallmark Christmas, right? We want like the story Christmas. Biblical Christmas is a little bit more chaotic. I'm just preparing you for what we're gonna see. And Matthew is one of the best at helping us feel some of that. And so I'm gonna turn things over to AJ, and he's gonna dive in head first into this mess. It's fascinating because Matthew can't even get 5 verses into the story of Jesus before we realize how messy things get. So AJ, take us in.
All right, so before we get started, imagine you're in my shoes, okay? You got a job at a church, and you're all excited, right? Your boss comes into your office, and he's like, okay, we're gonna let you speak. We're gonna get you up there. It's gonna be a Sunday morning. It's gonna be a great thing. And it's gonna be during Christmas. Oh, even easier, like I'm built for this. I don't even have to rest on my education. And then he tells you, we're gonna give you the genealogy. And he shuts the door, and so I have the genealogy. And it's no secret that the genealogy typically is something we don't get excited over. I would bet a lot of money that the portion of us that have done the yearly Bible reading took a little break when it came to Matthew 1, maybe took a day off. It's a list of names, right? What do I need a list of names for? It doesn't even relate to the chapter after. It doesn't have anything to do with the Christmas story. It's just a bunch of names. Why is that helpful? So first off, I go to Biola, and my Old Testament professor there, Carmen Imes, when we were going over the genealogy, she put it this way. She said that a genealogy is a repository of information that the narrator thinks is crucial to the development of the themes of the book. So in necessity, it's a data bank. It's basically here's something that you guys might relate to. It's like watching the first 3 Star Wars movies first, and then you watch the 4 and you get context. That's what we're doing right now. We're watching the first 3 to get context for the next 3. And what this does is it sets up what Matthew wants you to see. All the background information, all of the things before that really focus in on what Matthew wants you to see. So today we're gonna go right into Matthew 1, if they are there already, and this is what it says. So it says, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And we're gonna skip down to verse 5 today, all right? It says, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. And in the footnote of that, what you'll see is that David fathered Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. And we'll get to that later. So what's Matthew setting up here? Well, what Matthew wants to get at in the total arc of the genealogy is that God is the redeemer of our past, all right? There are so many different figures that are listed throughout this book that as much as I'd like to go over all of them with you today, I can't. But every single one of these people has some kind of key role in God's plan, a special role in the redemption arc of this entire thing. And so we're gonna be looking at 3 key figures today, but the first of which, as I listed in verse 5, is gonna be Rahab. So for those of you that are not familiar with Rahab, Rahab is what we would consider the unredeemable woman. During Rahab's time, she had a lot up against her. She was the worst of the worst. What led up to that is that in their culture during that time, her being a woman was a slight against her. So she's already got that going against her. Beyond that, she's a prostitute. Okay, so now she's not even cared for by her community. So take it down 2 rungs, and now her community rejects her, and now let's do it one more. She's not of God's people. You can't really run out of more options than she did. These 3 things really separated her from everything that made her valuable. And so what ends up happening in the story, a quick 30-second version, is that the Israelites are scoping out Jericho. They send in spies to kind of scout out the city, and they end up taking refuge with Rahab. She ends up not turning them over to the city officials, and in exchange, she wants safe haven. She wants to be included in be the people that are saved from the assured destruction of the city. Because she's telling them, hey, I've heard of what you've done to other people. If you want me to help you, don't do that to my family. And so what ends up happening in what you'll find in the story in Joshua 2, in 18 and 19, you'll see, unless when we enter the land, you have tied the scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father and mother and your brothers and all your family into your house. They're speaking about the oath. In the previous verse, it said, the man had said to her, the oath you made us will swear, it made us swear will not be binding on us unless you do these things. And so what this is they're making this agreement that if you want to remain passed over, really, separated, you need to hang this little red cord out your window. Everything else around you is about to be completely disintegrated, but this little cord's gonna save you. On what planet does that make any sense? She's heard of what they've done to other people. She knows what's coming. And are you mocking me by telling me this little red cord? But at this point in time, for Rahab, nothing else makes sense. No one else wants her or her family. And at this point, everything that they've been living with is about to be completely gone. And so what she ends up doing is being willing to step into this position of wanting to be separated in a way she's not used to. So what ends up happening is that she makes this decision and she gets, pardoned and it all happens, but now she's part of their group. So she's moved from being separated from everything that would make her valuable to separated for something. You see, you gotta be a pretty special person in a way to have your name in the line of Jesus. And by no means was Rahab that, but she's in there anyway. She moved from being separated from something to being separated for it. And what this continues is, what you'll see is Rahab bears a son, and his name is Boaz. If that rings any bells, that's because we just went over Ruth a few weeks ago. And if you remember in that story, Boaz is actually the one that ends up redeeming Ruth. So, I mean, in this scenario, Ruth's just in the unredeemable situation. She has been forgotten. She has been isolated. She's been left with nothing. And when you're in a situation like Ruth's, there's not much to look to, right? I mean, her mother-in-law has now taken the name Mara, which means bitterness, which she says, the Lord has treated me in this way, so just call me for what it is. That's my identity, is being bitter. I'm not worth anything. And so these two are forgotten. They're isolated. They're not worth anything to anyone. In fact, if they were to be redeemed, they'd be considered debt. And so the story goes on that Naomi sends Ruth to go glean in these fields, and she's picking up the scraps behind the harvesters, and Boaz notices her and inquires to her with his servants about her and finds out who she is, what she's been doing, and ends up calling her in and making her equal and then some to some of her servants. So what you'll find in Ruth 2, 10 and 11 is that after Boaz does this, at this, she bowed down with her face to the ground, and she asked him, "Why have I been found with such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" If you remember, she's a Moabite, so no, we can't do that. And Boaz replies to her, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before." So what ends up happening is Boaz recognizes this. Boaz not only then makes her equal to her servants and allows her to go in the fields and harvest with them, but he takes it a step further and tells his servants, "I want to take a piece from each of your bundles and give it to her." That not only are you being made equal, we're gonna put you above that. We're gonna make your situation not just redeemed, but and then some, to more than it was before. And so the story goes on, Ruth ends up offering herself to Boaz. Boaz has to go about a clever way to taking her as his wife. But what she is able to do in that, and what God has done in that, is that she's gone from being separated from her worth, from her humanity and her community, to now being moved into a place where she's embraced, she's loved, and she's now given a right to the inheritance of this house. She's a figure in this. She is equal. She is not seen as all these things that would make her unusable, unworthy. So what just happened right there? So God, through Rahab, this prostitute in Jericho, decides, I'm gonna save Rahab, right? I'm gonna set her apart. She's going to bear Boaz. Boaz is going to redeem Ruth, completely unrelated. But through Rahab's redemption, Boaz is able to redeem Ruth. So we bring Ruth into the family, then what happens? Well, if you read on, Ruth bears Obed. Obed bears Jesse, and then Jesse bears David. So God's getting a little creative with how he likes to work here, right? It's kind of like, well, why did we have to go through all of that? You could have just made it a little easier. And I agree, but that's not what he does. Matthew continues to capture this theme of redemption, but now we're gonna get to a story that's a little different, the story of Bathsheba. So as you may recall earlier when I said she had been, Matthew refers to as the woman who had been the wife of Uriah. Bathsheba is what we would consider to be a part of the unredeemed story. So I'm gonna quote a verse real quick from a different translation. At Beachpoint, we normally use NIV, but I wanna be very intentional for a second and quote from the NASB, and I'll tell you why after, okay? So we're gonna take a look at that story. In 2 Samuel 11, 1 through 4, it says, "Then it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they brought destruction on the sons of Amnon and besieged Rabbah. But David stayed in Jerusalem. Now at evening time, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof, he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. So David sent servants and inquired about the woman, and someone said, 'Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?' Then David sent messengers and had her brought. And when she came to him, he slept with her. And when she had purified herself from her uncleanliness, she returned to her house." So something I want to touch on real quick. The reason I quoted from that version is that that version of the Bible is the closest we have to the original language of what they had. The original Hebrew, in the original Greek, this is about as close as we get to that. And the reason I wanted to point that out is some of you may have been told this story before for some reason, people have told you that Bathsheba was somehow a playing party in this. That somehow she's up on the roof provoking David, making sure that he sees me doing this. According to that didn't happen. What actually did happen was something actually much more tragic. Not only does it say nothing about Bathsheba contributing to the situation, it actually details that Bathsheba was called in, she was raped, she was sent away, and she was kicked out. And she left used and abused and with nothing. That's hard. And Matthew intentionally writing, this is David, the man after God's own heart. This is David, the king of Israel, who's supposed to be trusted, the man that represents God, and yet he abuses this trust and taints her. And so the hard part about all this is that not only are we faced with this reality, but Matthew doesn't forget that. He could have named Bathsheba, sure. But instead he reminds you, what David has done has absolutely been forgiven, but it's not been forgotten. Bathsheba's story is still recognized. And what we're gonna see is that the hard part is we don't really see a redemption for Bathsheba throughout her story. It kind of ends there. We learn about, her family later on, and we learn about some of those things after that, but we just kind of stuck with that. But what Matthew's trying to get at in this larger picture is that no matter how large our hurt is, God's goodness is bigger. God could have chosen to work in any way, right? And mind you, we just covered 2 verses. This isn't even covering the rest of the family, the rest of the line. This is just 2. God could have chosen to work in any way, but he chose to work in this way. And it's just a hard reality to face, but what that communicates is that at some point our redemption comes, and it doesn't always come quickly. Sometimes that pain sits around for a while and we have to live with that. And that doesn't make it any easier, but that does give us the hope of redemption. That does give us the hope that God continues to come through. And as we enter this season of Advent, that's what's happening. We're waiting on that redemption.
Now, one of the crazy things, as AJ captured, as he said, 2 verses, is there's still one more story that you could have told. There's 4 women that are listed. Tamar, if you want to read Genesis 38, it's dark. It's another dark story. We figured you could handle 3. 4 would have been a little too much. But you realize that Matthew could have simply created the genealogy, never listed the women, but he does. And why does he do that? And I think one of the things that we see is that you and I see our story in this. We see our own brokenness. We see our own messiness of our lives. And I loved Pastor Rich Velotis in New York. He said it this way. He said, the people Jesus came from are the people Jesus came for. And it's such a good way of seeing it. The people Jesus came from are the people Jesus came for. And there's this way in which we see in this story, in the genealogy, we see our story. We see that there's a way in which we are all tied into this. And all of this genealogy is ultimately leading to Joseph, and you think, oh, well, finally we can get to Joseph and Mary, because that one's nice and pretty, and that one is simple, and it's all put together real easily. Verse 18, this is how the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. So because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. But after he considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. And when Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord commanded him and took Mary home as his wife. But he did not consummate the marriage until she gave birth to a son, and he gave him the name Jesus. God has completely interrupted the plans of Joseph and Mary. Joseph, we might say, has gone from being betrothed to being betrayed. Jewish marriage in that day was very different. You don't swipe right, find someone you like, go on a coffee date, start kind of establishing something over time, meet the parents, kind of do this date, get engaged, set up the knot.com, and then kind of put a big party down for everyone. You had an arranged marriage, most likely. Parents arranged this. There was a dowry, perhaps, that was paid to the parents. There was a whole thing that was set up. But to be betrothed, to be kind of this formal engagement, this was a formal ceremony. There were witnesses there. They were entering into a covenant. And the only way you enter out of this is by death or divorce. And so after a year of engagement, the woman would come, there would be a ceremony, a wedding ceremony. She'd be joined to the husband. So there's a lot that is about to happen. So when we put yourself in Joseph's shoes, if we take Luke and Matthew and we put them side by side, we realize Mary's had this first vision from the Lord, this angel that's appeared saying what's gonna happen. She has this immaculate conception. She as this begins to happen, she goes to visit Elizabeth, her cousin. She stays there. By the time she comes back, maybe it's 3-4 months later, and so you see your fiance, she's got her baby bump. You're 100% sure, not only is she pregnant, but you are not the father. I mean, this is not a simple thing. Jewish Roman law would have given him the ability to humiliate her if he wants, but we see that there's a sense of protecting her, doesn't want to disgrace her, he wants to handle things quietly. But Joseph realizes if he stays in this relationship, this will cause shame for him, it will cause shame for his family. And so he's moved on from plan A to plan B. This is when God interrupts his plans, as God often does for our lives. There's a way in which he enters in and says, look, I know you've got this other plan, but stay with me on this. I know it's gonna be messy, but I am with you. And he's invited into this plan. Now for Joseph, this is a costly plan. He will face physical risk, as we will see. Justin will share a little bit about this in a couple weeks. He's gonna face emotional risk. There is a whole reputation that he will eventually have to gain back. There's financial risk. He'll have to completely trust God for provision. And I think we see it in Joseph. There is certainly the ability, if he wants it, to say, no, thank you. He could avoid the risk. He could avoid the messiness. But he also would avoid the reward. Joseph, remember, is not just saying yes to a baby being born. He's saying yes to becoming a father. He's saying yes to raising this child. He's saying yes to a lifetime of commitment. And I love verses 24 and 25 because similar to Luke 1:38, you just see the spirit of these two people. He just obeys. He does everything that is asked of him. He takes her as his wife, he doesn't consummate the marriage. And even the right of the father to name the child, he gives him the name Jesus, as was commanded. And I think in this, we see the beauty of this is that God is not just the redeemer of our past, but God needs to be the leader of our future. He needs to be the one who leads our future. And sometimes as the leader of our future, he's going to lead us in things that are risky and messy and not as calculated as we would like it to be on our side. But he has full control. He knows exactly what he's doing. So what do you do with these 4 stories? What do you do with all this? I just want to invite you on this first Sunday for us here together. Here's what I want to invite us to do. If we're going to behold Jesus, if we're going to take in the beauty and the magnificence of what God is doing in Jesus, then we have to respond. And here's what I'm inviting you to do today is to surrender your messiness to him. See, until you surrender your messiness, you cannot behold Jesus as King. He will redeem your past and he will lead your future, but you have to be honest with him about the messy things that are in your life. This is how salvation happens. If your desire is to become a Christian, the way that we enter into the Christian life is we admit that we can't do it. We cannot save ourselves. We admit the messiness of sin in our life. We admit the messiness of I need you to save me because I cannot do it myself. Salvation is about surrendering the messiness of our lives. Growth as a Christian is about surrendering the messy parts of our life, that when the Spirit of God is leading us in a way that will be more life-giving, we are willing to say to God, all right, let's lean into this. When he brings up a part of our life that he says, look, let me help you form that in you. And we want to hold on to the old way. And he's saying, holding on to the old way will only lead you to pain. Trust me, I know it's going to get messy, but let me lead you towards life. Even I think of people serving, and I'm so impressed when I think of this in so many different ways, that so many people, if you were to sit and talk to them, the stories of people who serve and who lead, and some who even get to be your pastors, they would say, my story is a story of redemption. My story is a story of God interrupting my life, of God. I love the lyric as Mitch was singing, of rewriting my story. God has been rewriting my story was going some way, and now God is rewriting my story. And so this is what we want to invite you into. And so AJ is going to lead you into a kind of a final moment of reflection and prayer as we close out the service. But I just want to invite you to think about what it means now to surrender your messiness to the Lord.
I know this is all really heavy, but the thing is that this is really reality for a lot of us, is that as sure as we all want Christmas to look like it did before, it naturally just doesn't end up being that way all the time. The holiday season brings a lot of things, but it can't cure everything. And something that needs to be touched on is that what this is a reflection of is that God is so good that no matter how unredeemable you think your situation is, how unredeemable you are, or even if you think you never will be redeemed, that he can and will do that. That will look different for everyone, yes. But he is willing and able to do so. For Rahab, it came when she least expected it. For Ruth, it took a while, but it happened. And for Bathsheba, we're not sure. But they were part of something that is arguably the greatest thing the world has ever received. And God working through them was able to move everything. And so what's interesting is, something you guys may have noticed is that this board is over here and might be a little distracting. But there's a point to it. And I couldn't find a word bubble for Christmas online that looked like this. Didn't really, kind of hard to find. But the interesting thing about this is that the two bubbles really interact with one another. It looks like them intertwined. And so the point that we get from this is that this of course isn't a license to be messy, but this is a warrant. This does warrant our hope in the redemption that is to come. It brings us into that seating of waiting, and it reminds us that God redeems both the past, the present, and the future. That bubble combines these two things in a harmonious way that God uses. So what I want you to do today is that I want you to go ahead and bow. I'm going to lead you in this moment. I want you to think of your own Christmas word bubble. Things that surround this season, this time of year that you typically want to cover. Or maybe they're already in your face. I want you to take that, and I'm going to pray over you while you do this. I want you to take that and do your best to give that back to God. To be reminded of his trust, of his loyalty, of his consistency, of his ability to work through all of that. What God's communicating is that there's nothing that you ever have done, ever will do, can do to change that. You're not that cool. Whatever you think is big, God is 10 times bigger. And so today, I pray that God reminds you of that you can feel just how big he is and how he just wants to hold you in that. The redemption might not be now or tomorrow, but it is coming. So thank you, God, for allowing us to be a part of that and to have the opportunity to be a part of that.